Dark.
That dark?
Good evening. Thank you for all being here. Before we start, we just wanted to acknowledge all of the nurses that are in the room this evening. So happy Nurses Week and Nurses Month. Give yourselves a round of applause. On behalf of Joan, the Kaplan family, and the Kaplan Family Foundation, thank you for being here tonight. We know you are all very busy and appreciate you taking the time to participate in this important event. By the number of attendees here, it's safe to say that grief has profoundly impacted an overwhelming number of us in one way or another. While it may not often feel like it, it's important to remember that we don't need to navigate these feelings alone. That's why the Kaplan Family Foundation is embarking on this new community health initiative to educate and empower our communities. While our first presentation tonight is tailored for clinicians, we hope that for whatever reason you're here, you will better understand that emotions are universal and have no boundaries. Additional presentations for clinicians and the community will be announced shortly. It's important to remember that tonight is not about the foundation. It's about you and working together to build stronger, healthier communities. So the question is, how can the Kaplan Family Foundation help you make a difference? If all the red tape were cut, what ideas do you have to make a change? Those are the initiatives that the foundation is interested in hearing more about. So please don't hesitate, reach out and share your thoughts. And if you're not sure how to get in touch, please find me, Joan, any members of the Kaplan Family Foundation board or family after the program, and we'd be happy to provide you with the contact information. Thank you again for being here this evening, and now it's my pleasure to turn it over to Dr. Larry Force from Mount St. Mary's College. Thank you.
Thank you, Lauren. As Lauren said, my name is Larry Force, and on behalf of Joan Kaplan and the Kaplan Family Foundation, our Center on Aging and Disability Policy, and Mount St. Mary College, we welcome you here. You know how these types of initiatives work. How did it start? It started with a thought from Joan, and then it intersected with her heart. And the next thing you know, she started to talk about it, and here we are. And who did she start to talk about it with? What is now known as the committee. And that's Joan, myself, Lauren, Linda Serto, Wendy Keller, Tamara Hoffner, Mary Ellen Korsinski, Madison Sergi Flores. And also, we wouldn't be here without the work and being able to stitch it together of Deb Meisner, Amanda Maynard, our IT staff. They've been working on this for days, and Parkhurst. They've also been working on it for days. So thank you so much. The executive leadership, you can see, this is sponsored by the Kaplan Family Foundation, but the executive leadership of our collaborators, Access, Supports for Living with Ron Calavito, Montefiore, St. Luke's Cornwall Hospital with Dan Mahan and Margaret Deo Allers, and Cornerstone Family Healthcare with David Jolly, and Mount St. Mary College with Dr. Jason Atzett. If you could stop for a minute and if we could just applaud all of their efforts. So tonight we're really honored to have Dr. Doka here. Dr. Doka is a professor emeritus of the College of New Rochelle and senior vice president for grief programs for Hospice Foundation of America. He's one of the authors of the text, Dying and Death, Life and Living. He's a prolific author, Dr. Doka's books include End-of-Life Ethics in a Changing World, Shattered, Trauma and Loss, Living with Grief Since COVID-19, When We Die, Extraordinary Experiences at Life's End, Intimacy and Sexuality During Illness and Loss Aging America, Coping with Loss, Dying and Death and Journey, and I could go on and on. Dr. Doka is the author and editor of over 40 books. In addition to these books, he's published over 100 articles and book chapters. He's the editor of both Omega, the Journal of Death and Dying and Journeys, a newsletter to help in bereavement. He has an ongoing blog for Psychology Today entitled Good Morning. Dr. Doka was elected president of the Association of Death Education and Counseling in 1993. In 1995, he was elected to the board of directors of the International Work Group on Dying, Death, and Bereavement and served as chair. The Association for Death Education and Counseling presented him with an award for outstanding contributions in the field of death education in 1998 and significant contributions to the field in 2014. He's been presented with outstanding contributions across the whole field. His alma mater, Concordia College, presented him with their first Distinguished Alumnus Award. He is a recipient of Caring Hands Award as well as the Dr. Robert Fulton Founders Award. He was grandfathered in as a mental health counselor in 2006 under New York State First Licensure of Counselors. Dr. Doka has keynoted conferences throughout North America and Europe and Asia. He participates in the annual Hospice Foundation of America. Dr. Doka is an ordained Lutheran minister. Just a little bit more. When I was 23 years old, Dr. Doka hired me for my first job as an adjunct at Concordia College. And across the years, our collaboration has continued in various projects, but more importantly, our friendship has deepened. And even though I talk about being 23, there's another connection that goes back even further. And Dr. Doka, when he was studying to be a minister, a Lutheran minister, he worked under the mentorship of Dr. Eva Kahana, Dr. Jeffrey Kahana's mother, at Wayne State. And I have pictures to prove all of this, okay? So if you want to see those pictures, they're great pictures. So with that, it's my honor to welcome Dr. Ken Doka. Dr. Doka. Thank you, buddy.
Good evening. I have to say that my son once heard that introduction, an introduction very similar to that, and he had a very succinct way of summing it up. He said, "Dad, what it really means is you have no life." So I guess you'll make that judgment yourself. I'm honored to be here tonight, and I really want to add my thanks to Joan Kaplan and the Kaplan Family Foundation, and of course to the Mount St. Mary and all the organizations which sponsor this. So join me one more time in giving them a thanks. I also want to thank Dr. Force, as he said, when he was 23, I hired him for an adjunct position, never dreaming that we'd end up having an association of over 50 years and the rich collaboration and friendship that has gone with it. So I appreciate that, Larry. As I speak tonight, I'm very well aware that there are people in this audience for different reasons. And some of you are here because of your clinical interest in the field of grief, and some of you are here because you're personally grieving. And that really doesn't make too much of a difference, because inevitably all of us, whether our primary reason today is personal or professional, have dealt with our own personal grief. And sometimes when somebody gets up here and speaks about it, it inevitably brings up some of those losses. So my take-home message tonight, or one of my take-home messages, is take good care of yourself this evening. And if you begin to understand or begin to think about some of the losses you've had, that's very normal and very natural in circumstances like this. There's also a professional issue too, and that is, any way of dying that echo? Can we? How's that? A little better, I think. Maybe not. Okay, can AV do something about that echo? Okay, that sounds better. I hope. Okay, in any case, some of you are here for a variety of reasons, but clinically, I think one of the dangers of sessions like this is somebody like me gets up here and says, you know, when you have this situation, you should do A, B, and C, and avoid doing D and F. And you think, oh my gosh, the last time I had this situation, I started with F, moved on to G, H, and I. If you experience that professional discontinuity, that professional bump, I think it's important to remember a couple of things. And the first is, when somebody like me speaks, we're always speaking in generalities. What works best for most people most of the time. Individual situations are always different. I think a second thing to remember is that even when we do the right thing, it doesn't always work out the way we'd like. A number of years ago, I read an article that I began to assign to all my classes called On Doing Everything Right, a Case Study in Failure. And it was written by a clinician who had counseled a suicide, a person who died by suicide, a person who originally was suicidal in behavior, and then counseled him, and during the course of treatment, this person died by suicide. And of course, the therapist was devastated. And he recalls in this article going one Friday after he got home from work, upset with this over the last week or so, and put all his textbooks on one end of the dining room table, the largest land surface, and all his case notes on the other end. And he kept going in this obsessive review from one to the other, saying, what did I do wrong? Where did I make my mistake? And of course, he comes to the conclusion that he did everything right, and still things didn't turn out the way he had hoped and the way he had expected. And that's a good lesson for us to remember. Sometimes we do everything right, and it doesn't always work out as well as we should, or as well as we hope. When I read that article, I remember one of the things he said is, after he processed that, he said, I began to think about, you know, my client, and I began to say, you know, almost, how dare you die by suicide? Didn't you realize what a good therapist you had? And then he also said something which struck me very, very much at home. And he said, I also was angry at my professors because they always gave you the feeling that if you did everything right, everything would turn out well. And that was a lesson that it didn't. So what I ended up doing was actually incorporating more of my failures and my frustrations into my lectures, because I think that's an important point. Well, let's begin. And our key questions for tonight are, how can we understand the experience of grief? What factors complicate or mitigate grief? How can we assist grieving persons? What are the current models of the grieving process, and how can we use them? Let's start with some basic definitions. When I first proposed a course at the College of New Rochelle on grief, mourning, and bereavement, the first question I got asked by academic review was, aren't those terms redundant? And they're really not. A bereavement refers to an objective state of loss. To be bereaved means that somebody you were attached to has died or is lost in some other way. Grief is really the subjective response to that loss, how we respond to that. And these responses and these reactions can be manifested, as we'll see in a few moments, physically, affectively, cognitively, behaviorally, even spiritually. Mourning is used in two different ways. Generally, or at least beginning to, is the cultural practices and rituals that are associated with loss. So when we go to a funeral, we're engaged in mourning. Now, many times we might not actually be grieving. We might be going to a funeral of someone we know very remotely, and their death really hasn't touched us. But we're there out of respect for maybe a friend or somebody else. And then it's also been used to refer to the psychic process of working through grief, which is also called grieving or grief work. So I guess we always start by getting our definitions straight. So what are some current theories of grief? And probably many of you know Kubler-Ross's theory. How many of you ever come across Kubler-Ross's theory? The 5 stages? Okay. You all remember that? Please forget it. Okay. Kubler-Ross's work was wonderfully pioneering for her time, which was over 50 years ago. It's now considered a very outdated thing, a very outdated notion, for a lot of reasons. It's hard to think that people who are so very different in so many ways are going to respond to the one final or a major final crisis in their life by in the same manner, in the same way. So we really, it's not one of our current theories of grieving. What are? Well, one of the models that's very current is what's called the dual process model. This is a model by 2 researchers called Strobe and Schutt in the Netherlands, and they say that whenever we deal with grief, we deal with 2 different processes. One is we have to deal with the loss, and one is we have to deal with living a life now in the face of the loss. And healthy grieving involves oscillating, moving between both of those stages, both of those different processes. Let me get the word stages out of my vocabulary. So we oscillate, we move between them. Let me give you an example. A number of years ago, a widow came into me that I was regularly seeing, and I said, "How are things going?" And she said, "For the first time since my husband died, I balanced the checkbook." And she took great pride in that. And the next week when she came in, she said to me, "You know, when I left your office that day, I began to think that if John were alive, I wouldn't have to worry about that." You know, that going back and forth between adjusting to loss and living a life now in the face of loss. That's one of our current approaches. Another current approach is what we call, from Robert Niemeyer, is what we call meaning construction, or a narrative approach to grief. And this is the notion that one must reintegrate the loss into one's sense of the world, either by assimilating it into our worldview or modifying the perspective to accompany the loss. That was one of the difficulties, for example, in COVID. During the pandemic, people died by an unexpected new disease at all different kinds of ages, and we had no way of really kind of conceptualizing that or thinking of that. So that would be an example of meaning reconstruction. You know, and again, part of that might be assigning blame. Who am I now? Larry mentioned I'm a Lutheran minister, and I've done a lot of work with clergy and clergy families over the years. And you know, and think of the wife of a Lutheran minister. In my branch, they would be wives. We still haven't gotten to ordain women yet, which I have my own issues with, but we'll get there eventually. But for example, many of these women lived their lives as adjunct pastors, so to speak, as part of what was really important. And now, of course, they couldn't do it anymore. So the question was, who am I now? How do we reconstruct identity? How do we reconstruct our assumptive world? COVID really threw a blow at that, if you think about it. You know, we like to think that the world is safe, benevolent, and predictable. How many of you, if I would have told you 4 years ago that there'd be a modern-day plague that would close everything down, would have believed me? I wouldn't have believed myself. Who thought that could happen? Sometimes in grief, it helps to find what we call benefit finding. This doesn't mean that you're glad the person died or the person was lost, but that you've grown from some of the experiences you've had as a result of that. And of course, it may affect what we believe about the afterlife, the deity, and everything else. The final model, which we're going to spend some time on today, is what's called the task of grief by Bill Warden. And William Warden says that when you're grieving, and this is really the first break from the stage model, William Warden says that when you're grieving, there are a number of different issues that you have to contend with. Tasks. Everyone does these tasks in their own way. Everyone does them in their own time, in their own order. And some of us are good at certain tasks, maybe not so good at others. So what are these tasks? Well, the first thing we have to do is to acknowledge the loss. How many times have some of you, when you've experienced a loss, have had thoughts like, this is just a bad dream. I'm going to wake up and this is going to be over. And then we have to say, we have to acknowledge the grief. Or maybe a divorce where you say, I'm sure he or she will come back once they get to their senses. And of course, that doesn't happen. A second task of grief is to experience the pain of grief, the manifest and latent emotions, whatever grief arouses in us. A third is to adjust to a changed life. Life now is going to be very different. A number of years ago, I had someone speak to me, and she was a mother whose 16-year-old son died on vacation in Acapulco from a brain aneurysm. And she said something that really struck me because my son was about 14 at the time. And she said, not only did I lose my son, I simultaneously lost all of his friends. You know, think about that. When a death occurs or any loss occurs, whether it's divorce or the like, often what happens is that we have all kinds of it's like throwing a rock into the middle of a pond. We have all kinds of secondary losses. You know, we don't. And I thought about that because my house was full of his friends. You know, they would always come over. I used to have to buy during the summer extra soda and potato chips just to keep them stocked. But all of a sudden, that would all disappear from my life. And all those changes whenever we have a serious loss. And then finally for Bill Warden, but I added one more, we have to relocate the loss. This is one of the changes in our understanding of grief. When Freud talked about grief almost over a century ago, and really what began the modern study of grief in Mourning and Melancholia, he talked about eventually you have to emotionally detach from the person. That the energy you have placed in the person who is now lost, you have to withdraw that emotional energy and reinvest it in others. We now know that that does not happen. That rather what happens is that we relocate the person in our life. We have a continuing bond with that person. We still remember that person. They're part of our identity. We'll talk about that a little bit more later on. And so Warden speaks about it this way. We have to find an enduring connection with the deceased, even as we embark on a new life. And I thought the problem with Warden is that sometimes we have to reconstitute our whole faith in philosophical systems that have now been challenged by loss. One of my examples of that is a number of years ago, somebody came into my office and he said to me, it was in the early 80s, he said, I know you're a Lutheran minister. Can you work with someone who's, how did he put himself, as a secular humanist? And I said, tell me what that means. What do you mean by saying you're a secular humanist? And he said, I never believed in a deity up there, but I believe that everybody holds a divine spark in their own heart. And that our job is to fan that spark in us and ignite it in others. And so we began to work together. And what happened with him is his life reflected his beliefs. He was a lawyer involved in advocacy causes. He was, worked, he said, I get paid for that. But he liked to volunteer for a homeless shelter in his neighborhood. He lived in an old brownstone that constantly needed restoration. And once he got to know one of the homeless men there, or a few of the homeless men there, he'd invite them to work on his house because he believed that labor was a way to gain respect. And he'd pay them a good wage, and if the family was sitting down for dinner, he'd invite them to sit down with them and pay them a good wage. And treat them as an honored guest, I should say. And one of the people he so befriended came back one day and brutally raped and murdered his 14-year-old daughter. And he said to me, when we first began to talk about this, he said, I've come to terms with the loss of my daughter. What I have yet to come to terms with is the loss of everything I believed. You know, these beliefs that if you treat people well, they'll respond well. And so that became the issue that we worked on. And this, of course, from Warden. So what are the ways that persons tend to experience grief? And this is really important. It's important for assessment, but most important, it's important for validation. When I do what I call community lectures on grief, one of the questions that I get asked most often is this normal? You know, people come up to you and after, it's been 6 months, I'm still feeling bad. Matter of fact, I'm feeling worse than I was before. Is this normal? And most of the time when we look at the process of grief, the answer is yes. But we need that validation. We need that normalization. Whether we're the therapist offering it or the client who needs it. Oops. So, grief may be manifested in a number of ways. We're going to look at these physically, emotionally, cognitively, spiritually, behaviorally. We often think of grief more only as an emotion, but it's far more than that. So physically, you can have all kinds of things. You name it. Dizziness, headaches, exhaustion, digestive difficulties, tremors, menstrual irregularities, erectile dysfunction, muscular aches. You know, one of my favorite stories of a client is a client came in to me very annoyed. She had been referred to me by her physician because she had tremors. And when she walked in, she looked at me and she had this shaking, and she kept saying, "He thinks it's in my head. Does this look like it's in my head?" You know? And I found out that her doctor had said, you know, we've done every physical test possible. Something else may be going on. You just had the loss of your husband. I think it might be good to speak to a grief counselor and see where we go from there. So, you know, as soon as I saw the shaking, my first question was, have you ever experienced that before? She said, when I was a little girl, she said, whenever I got very angry, I would shake with anger. And I looked at her, you know, and I said, "Are you angry now?" And she said, "Furious." And as she talked about her anger, she began to talk about her anger. And she said, my husband and I both worked, and when we'd get home, I'd make supper for him. He got home later. He said, and then he retired first. And he said, and so the process was that when I came home, I'd have to clean up all the dishes he left during the day, and then I have to make supper. But she was one of those women who was very passive, and she never really confronted him and said, you know, at least clean up the house, or maybe you could start dinner. She never confronted him on that, but she had this seething kind of anger that he never seemed to get that might be helpful. And of course, he's been lonely all day, so he kept calling her into the living room to want to talk about something, maybe something on TV or not. Meanwhile, she's in the kitchen being angry. And then one night, he said, you know, my chest is hurting me a little bit. And she said, you want to go to a doctor? He said, no, just leave it. He died in his sleep that night. And so as she began to talk about her anger, you know, about their relationship in the last few years of their life and how he died when he could have maybe not, literally, the shaking stopped. I always caution my classes that therapy doesn't usually work that well that quickly. You know what was also annoying about that case? After we did that, she kept talking about what a brilliant physician she had. I kept thinking, well, what, meatloaf? You know, had a roll too. So you can have any kinds of these physical kinds of reactions. Interesting study by one of my colleagues. Jane Nichols was a real pioneer in what we call prenatal loss. And Jane was one of the first people in the 70s who began to work on prenatal loss as a result of her own losses. She really had a remarkable history. She had finished college with a humanities major, and then what had happened is she had married a funeral director, and she had a series of miscarriages before she completed a pregnancy. And you remember in those days, in the late 1960s, early 1970s, there was no support for perinatal loss, miscarriages, abortions, or or any of those kinds of prenatal losses, stillbirths. So Jane had had a couple of miscarriages and a couple of stillbirths before she had her daughter, and basically, as she said, the support that I got was, you're young, you're healthy, go out and get pregnant again. There were no cards, no Hallmark cards in those days. There was no acknowledgement of that kind of loss. And when Jane's her last stillbirth, she asked, she was married to this funeral director, and she said, we want to bury him. We want to bury the baby. And the funeral director looked askance at her and said, we no longer have the body. We disposed of it as medical waste, was the term he literally used. So he couldn't give her the body, but he did give her a psychiatric consult, because he thought that question was so out of line and out of touch. But Jane thought, as she left there, she said, I wonder if other physicians, I wonder if other people going through this think the same way that they do, or the same way, or more the same way that I do, that this was a significant loss, and it needs to be acknowledged, and it needs to be dealt with. And so she said, I'm going to teach myself research methods and do a study. You know how hard that can be. And she said, and I have to get it published in a medical journal because physicians don't read anything else. And she said, so she really trained herself in research methodology, wrote an article, and had it published in, I think, the New England Journal of Medicine. And then she got reprints of the article when it was published. She went back to Children's Hospital in Akron, Ohio, to the head of the perinatal unit, and says, here's research that says you don't do things well. So the first thing you need to do is to hire me to train your staff and support your mothers and fathers so they start doing things better. And how can I put it? Commenting, Children's Hospital hired her. She became head of a special bereavement unit in the perinatal unit, and later on other parents said we need it too, so she became director of bereavement services, a totally new position with a whole new staff in Children's Hospital in Akron, Ohio. Remarkable career, right? Well, in her research, she found that these women who had experienced perinatal loss, miscarriages, stillbirths, often talked about pain, what's sometimes called phantom pain, talked about pain. Where do you think they experience pain most? Heart, okay. Heart and breast, number 2. You got it. You read that piece. Nobody guesses that offhand. I always get, stomach, uterus, heart, head, but that's it. Upper arms. Because those are the muscles you use to lift a baby, and those are the muscles you lift to hug a baby. And so again, our grief can be very, very symbolic at times, but it can be experienced physically. And again, one of the things to be careful about is that when you're doing an assessment, you always have to look at health. You always have to ask questions about physical symptoms. And physical symptoms ought to be addressed by, if they're persistent, you have to refer to a physician. Because especially with older widows, older widows particularly, have higher morbidity and mortality in the year after the death of their spouses. Probably for 3 reasons. One of which we call the joint unfavorable environment. That is, most people die today of chronic diseases, and most chronic diseases have lifestyle factors. So, it may be a situation where you're both eating the same bad diet, or one party's smoking and the other party's breathing in secondhand smoke. Grief is stressful. And stress, of course, affects health, particularly in populations like older people who are very vulnerable to it. And then finally, we have lifestyle changes. Maybe the wife who cooked 3 solid meals each day for her and her husband now is eating out of tuna fish cans. or the couple that went to exercise and walked every night now is just sitting in front of the TV in a depressed state of mind. So again, always important to assess health when you're working with grieving clients. And again, that was found to be very, very important with older persons with chronic conditions. And then we also experience grief emotionally. Of course, that's major. One of the most major ones that we often don't think about is guilt. How many of you, and I'm showing my age now, how many of you remember the song, Love is a Many Splendored Thing? Guilt is a many splendored thing. Be a great song for Frank Sinatra if he were still alive. And actually, we found that guilt can be 6 different types of guilt. Death causation. I should have made him stop smoking. Should have made her go to a doctor. Should have taken my son to a doctor as soon as he started complaining about pain. You know, and as I said, these things don't have to be rational to be really felt. Cultural role guilt. You can just fill out the sentence. I should have been a better mother, father, sister, daughter. Moral guilt. This is a punishment for something that I've done. Survivor guilt. It should have been me. This often happens among siblings, and this often happens in when a younger person predeceases an older person. Recovery guilt, and this is what's so strange about it. Some people will feel bad about feeling good. Went to the movie tonight, had a good time. How can that happen? My husband just died. My child just died. Or the other side of that, grief guilt. They feel bad about feeling bad. I should be getting over this. So you'll see all kinds of guilt coming out in grief very often. Relief, too. We don't think of relief, but there's a wonderful book called Liberating Losses. And, you know, and it's very common. We may feel relief that the person's suffering is over, that our suffering is over, or both. Caregiving is difficult. Anger. Anger is a good one. You know what the term, anybody know the root of the term bereft, bereaved? It means having something, I guess it's best translated by an old 70s expression to be ripped off. It means to have something grabbed away from you. And in many ways, when somebody does that, how do we feel? Feel angry, right? So anger is a very, very common emotional reaction to grief. We may even be angry and find it hard to admit it to the person who died. We may even feel a sense of emancipation, particularly in more troubling relationships, more ambivalent relationships, that now this burden of this relationship is no longer there. Again, sadness and loneliness, very common. Yearning for the person. Fear and anxiety. One we don't talk about a lot, but jealousy. And I always ask about that sometimes, if I sense that might be important, because people don't like to talk about that one. But, you know, many times you'll say, you know, here we were married, we had this lovely relationship for 35 years, and my wife dies, and my brothers and his wife, all they do is fight, separate, get back together again, and she's still alive. You know, it's not uncommon to hear things like that when you deal with loss and grief. And of course, sometimes we can have positive emotions. And what I mean by positive emotions is not that I'm glad the person is dead, but, you know, I'm glad I had this role in their life. And while I will miss them, there's so much about them that I care about and so much about them that I loved. A number of years ago, a good friend of mine died, and I was godfather to his 4-year-old son, his just turned 4-year-old son. And I barely knew the kid. I had met him a few times on birthday celebrations and the like. But I remember when I saw him at the funeral, this little forlorn figure trying to figure out what was going on. I had a tremendous feeling of love for him. And I kind of remember saying to myself, okay, kid, you don't know who I am really, but I'm going to be there for you. And you're going to know who I am soon. You know, and we have a wonderful relationship to this day. And he's in his 40s now, which he wouldn't like me to tell you. By the way, you can look him up. He's a rap artist by the name of Concept One with a K. So if you want to look into his songs, you can do that. So we can have all these different kinds of reactions and all these different kinds of emotions. But guilt is one of the most significant ones. And again, if you find high levels of guilt, that is often a factor that's complicating in grief. It also affects us cognitively. We may feel depersonalized. We may have disbelief and denial. We may have idealization. We idealize the person who died. You ever hear the old joke about that? Pastor is speaking to a congregation, and he says, nobody knows a perfect person, do they? And everybody in the congregation nods their head, in agreement. No, they don't know a perfect person. But one guy is nodding his head, yes. This bothers the pastor. He says, I mean a really perfect person. A person who's never done anything bad. It goes on for about 5 minutes. And again, people are shaking their heads even more strongly, except this guy is going in the front like this. And he goes at it one more time because he really wants to make his point. He said, I mean a person never even thinks the wrong thing, does the wrong thing, thinks bad thoughts. Nobody knows anybody like that, right? Going on for about 10 minutes. And everybody in the congregation is laughing now and saying, not even close. And this one guy is nodding his head, yes. And he says, who, sir, is that perfect paragon? And the man answers, my wife's late husband. But the point I'm trying to make there is that's one of the problems with idealization, is that idealization may make other relationships, subsequent relationships, very difficult. We find that often in sibling deaths, where the sibling who dies becomes the perfect child, which creates an impossible standard for his siblings to move up to. They're always being negatively compared to this child who's now perceived as saintly. We can also find the other one, demonization, a preoccupation with the deceased, confusion, obsessive thinking, often about preventability. How could have I prevented this? Inability to concentrate, a search for meaning, and what we call extraordinary experiences. And extraordinary experiences are those experiences that really, I'm just giving you the sidebar, but they're very common in bereavement. And they can include a number of different things. One is just a sense of presence. And I'm going to describe these, and I'm going to ask you to raise your hands at the end to see how many of you have ever had these experiences in grief. And a sense of presence is just a sense where you feel the person's presence around you. It doesn't involve any of the senses. You just feel that that person is around you who is deceased. A second one is a sense experience. The first time I ever experienced this as a counselor, and nothing was written about this, and I was just a new counselor, probably about 27 years old, and a woman came to me, and her daughter had died about 3 years of age, about a year ago, a year before, of sudden infant death syndrome. That's late for that to happen, but it can happen even within that range of the first 3 or 4 years. And she came in one day, and she was going to counseling. This was her first child, and at this point her only child. And she was questioning, one of the questions we were dealing with in counseling is to whether or not she should have other children. Because she basically said, nobody can tell me this can't happen again, and I can't go through this again. It's not how I want to do this. I can never lose another child like this. And then one day she walked into my room almost aglow, and I said, how are you doing? And she said, I had this remarkable experience. She said, when my daughter died, one of the little rituals my daughter and I had was that every time I went out and I put on my perfume, she would have me put perfume on her. And then she'd run around the house making everyone smell how she smelled nice, just like Mommy. And she said when she died and she was in the casket, I took that bottle of perfume and I anointed her with it and left the bottle in the casket because it was too associated with her. And I changed my brand because it just brought up, whenever I put it on, it would bring up memories of her. I knew that. She said, this morning when I walked into my daughter's room, I smelt the smell of that perfume all over the room. It hasn't been in our house for a year. And she said, and I asked my husband to come in, and he smelt it. Without even my prompting, he identified it as well. I was shocked. I didn't know what to say. I didn't know what to do. I didn't know whether this was an hallucination that I ought to be worried about, but it seemed to be helpful to her. So the question I asked turned out to be the right question. And I said, what did it mean to you? And she said, it was my daughter's way of saying she's okay. And soon after that, she decided to have subsequent children. And over the years, I would get notes from her marking the graduation from kindergarten of her next child and all those little milestones that children go through. Another kind of experience is a symbolic experience. Lou LeGrand, who's written a lot about this, talks about the fact that one of his first experiences with a client was a client who came in who said, you know, Lou, whenever I come to see you, I always stop at the cemetery where my 16-year-old son is buried. And she said, today when I stopped there was a red hawk right on the grave, right on the tombstone. And she said he kind of cocked his head at me and then slowly flew off. And he said, and that had significance? He said, my son's nickname was Hawk. You know, these kinds of experiences. Other kinds of experiences are what we call third-party experiences, when somebody else says something that seems like it's a message from the deceased, or very, very common, dreams. And these dreams can be of two types. They can be what we call basic grief dreams that are very symbolic. One of the ones that one client shared with me is her mother died very suddenly. She was playing tennis one day and literally dead the next. Mother was in her 80s. And she said in my dream, and it was a repetitive dream, I'm in an airplane. And my mother is traveling next to me, and she gets up to use the restroom. And she's taking, she said, a lot of time in using the restroom, and then the announcement comes on to return to your seats. My mother is not returning yet. So she says, so I called the flight attendant. I said, would you check the bathrooms? My mother's in one of them, you know, and she hasn't returned yet. Just make sure she's okay. The flight attendant checks, comes back and says, there's nobody in the bathrooms, honey. And it was interesting, she was having a hard time, and one of the techniques you can use with dream work is to simply say, title the dream. And as soon as she titled it, she understood it. She titled it, Vanished into Thin Air, which is exactly how she perceived her mother's death. She had vanished into thin air. And then the other are what we call visitation dreams. These are quite easy to interpret. You know, this is where Grandpa comes and says, remember, the stocks are in the box in the closet. And again, relatively common phenomena. About 60% of bereaved people claim to have experienced it. And again, in some cultures it's more common, some cultures less common. And then we can have faith struggles, we can have searches for meaning, we can have changes in spiritual behavior. Sometimes people will use humor in grief. And again, humor can be fine, because it's an effective way to release emotional energy. And we can behave in all different kinds of ways. Some of us avoid reminders, some of us seek reminders. We have all different ways of dealing with grief. And some of us are relatively resilient. There's a new book that's come out recently in the last few years by Bonanno, who's called The Other Side of Sadness. And I look at it as a corrective. I think he gets overtaken by his thesis, but I look at it as a corrective because he points out that some people have a comparatively limited reaction to loss. In other words, they don't have strong grief reactions, and that doesn't mean they don't have strong attachments. Part of it is the situation. They tended to have fewer losses or other stress. The death was not so sudden, so they had a chance to say goodbye. They tended to have an intrinsic spirituality, whether theistic or not. And they tended to have good psychological health, meaning no prior history of depression, anxiety, or other kinds of disorders. And again, we can learn from them. They tended to have an optimistic mindset. They tended to look at life as a challenge that was exciting. They believed that even in the worst situations, they could learn and grow. And they really focused on positive memories. So we do see some people with more resilient reactions toward grief. And then there are the behaviors that I call yellow light behaviors, behaviors on the edge. This is where they take on the behavior of the deceased or begin to experience symptoms of the deceased's illness. And sometimes taking on the behaviors of the deceased can be that they really can't let that person go and are trying to incorporate the person into themselves. or same with illness. Or sometimes it's just that, maybe dad was the disciplinarian and now that dad died, mom has to take a more assertive role with the kids. So you have to really look at that one. And then there are situations that are just downright dangerous. Self-destructive behaviors, behaviors destructive to others, or that grief really disables them in key roles. And of course, one of the things that Freud tried to do 100 years ago was to differentiate mourning and melancholia. And if some of you followed the conflicts in the DSM-5, the New Diagnostic Statistical Manual, we still haven't fully accepted a consensus on that, because they both share common manifestations. And again, grief is more transient and generally does not involve a loss of self-esteem. And one of the things I think that the DSM did well is that there was what was called a bereavement exclusion. So depending on the version of DSM that you had, you couldn't be diagnosed with depression if you had a loss in 3, 6 months, whatever the particular standard was in that particular edition. Now, that's not the case. And a lot of the fears that people had about over-medication really don't seem to be the case. So again, research indicated, and research does indicate that therapy along with medication is better than either one alone. So how do we assess for grief then? Well, we always have to take into account where we are developmentally. Children are going to grieve differently than adults. Grief is a very, very individual reaction. So in assessing grief, we need to know the nature of the relationship. What kind of relationship was it? And the nature of the relationship is not only are we talking about mothers or fathers or sisters or brothers, who that person is, spouses, but we're also looking at other things like how ambivalent the relationship is. Most of us have some ambivalence in close relationships, right? Right? You got to participate with me here, okay? Got to come alive here. All right. I think we have to turn on the lights maybe. I'm just joking on that. Maybe not. But for example, most of our relationships have some degree of ambivalence, right? Oh, okay. A little lower, but I think we're in better shape when I can see the audience. That good? All right. You good with that? All right. Take a minute to adjust. Okay. Thank you. When my son was 15 years old, I used to say, well, from 13 to 15, I used to say I love my son deeply, but I don't always like him. Because he was tough. Again, nothing legally, nothing problematic, just attitude. But it got annoying all the time. Okay? Now I have to tell you that now when my son talks about his childhood to my grandson, we used to call him St. Michael of Alder Drive. We didn't live with St. Michael of Alder Drive, but evidently St. Michael of Alder Drive lived in the same house. We never met him, but he was always very innocent. The nature of the but here's the thing. Ambivalent relationships and highly dependent relationships are most likely to complicate grief. In other words, if we're highly dependent on someone who dies, that's going to be a complicating factor. But ironically, it's the most ambivalent relationships that cause the most trouble. And that's really a factor in complicated grief reactions. And think about that. That makes sense. If we have a relatively unambivalent relationship with somebody, there's not a lot of unfinished business. But it's the love-hate relationship. Please.
I'm so sorry, but we're having a really hard time hearing you.
Oh.
That might be why you're not getting quite as much.
Okay.
From us
I'm
as you would like.
sorry about that. Is this better? How is that?
Oh, that's great.
Thank you. Okay. I was wondering. Okay, so the downside of that, let me just take off this jacket. Thank you. I'm going to stop here. The downside of that is that, of course, the more ambivalent the relationship, the more. Is that better? Thank you. I'm glad we resolved that. Okay, the nature of the attachment. People who have had a secure attachment are more likely to have better relationships and less ambivalence. The circumstances of the loss. Early on in the field, we did a lot of work on, is it worse to lose somebody this way or that way? We know now that's not a good question. Just bad to lose somebody. The circumstances certainly will affect it, but grief follows any loss. What's the personality and what's the history of the griever? What kind of family and social support are people doing? There's a famous article by Colin Murray Parks, one of the what I would call the grandfather of grief studies, and he asked the question in his article, who needs grief counseling? You know what his answer was, based on his research? Was the people who have good support systems generally do not need it as much as the people who have inappropriate or difficult or inaccessible support systems. Culture and spirituality. And again, a key question when you're assessing grief is, what do I need to know about your culture? What do I need to know about your spirituality to work with you effectively? And that's not a question I would directly ask a client, but that's what I want to know. And then, of course, what else is going on in their life? It's hard to deal with grief. Grief is stressful. But if you've lost your job and this is happening, then of course it's even more problematic. And then what's your own health and what's your own coping abilities? So again, grief assessment also includes a loss inventory. What prior losses have you had? How did the client respond to those losses? How are those losses affecting the current loss, if they are? And also remember, one of the things that was interesting about Freud, you know how Freud would always start? With a case study? Anybody want to guess what case study he begins Mourning and Melancholia with? Bereaved parent, bereaved spouse. It was a bride abandoned at the altar. And I think what Freud is trying to remind us is it's not about death. It's about loss. It's loss that affects us. And again, when you find inconsistent responses, that's a danger signal. When somebody says, I cried when my mother died, I wept when my father died, and then when my son died, I was emotionless. Something's going on there. We need to understand that. And so what are the three major predictors? Again, the nature of the relationship, conflict, dependence, ambivalence, pre-existing conditions like anxiety and depression, and then just the therapist's global feeling. How is this person doing? It can be really important. And again, what we want to do is we want to assess attachment styles. You know what a secure attachment is? If you go back to Bowlby, secure attachment is, you learn very early. Bowlby mostly talked about mothers, but we realize now it goes beyond that there's got to be a secure figure in your life when you're growing up to attach with, and people who have a secure attachment, ironically, are the ones who can deal with loss best. Again, like ambivalence, there's no other business. Give you an example. When my grandson went for his first day of school, Grandpa and his parents are waiting at the bus station with him. My daughter-in-law is about ready to burst into tears. And he happily walks on the bus, waves, and then goes sits by a friend. And she was heartbroken. Said he didn't cry at all. I said, that's a good sign. That means he has a secure attachment. That means he knows that when he comes back, you're going to want to hear about his day. You're going to be there for him. That's a good thing. So again, we want to know an attachment style. And then we also have to look at the environment. What kind of support is offered in the community and work, all of these kinds of questions. So we want to be aware of that. Okay. Well, let's talk a little bit more about grief theories and grief processes and how we actually counsel clients, okay? Well, I like to use the metaphor of roller coaster. Grief is often a roller coaster for many people. You have your ups and downs, your highs, your lows, good days, and your bad days. How many of you have ever ridden a roller coaster? Okay. Well, if you start on a roller coaster, what's the worst part of the roller coaster? When you just get on? Your first drop, right? That's like grief, too. First 4 to 6 weeks, most people are doing better than they are after. Because you get a lot of support, you're still in shock, you have a lot to do, and it's after that. One person said, the first time I realized I was alone was when I came home and there was no sympathy card in the mail. And when I went to the phone, there were no sympathy calls. He said, I realized it's me now who has to deal with this. So again, the roller coaster analogy is good, but always be careful, because if I had a client, and I use this analogy a lot. If I had a client, the first thing that I would ask that client is, have you ever ridden a roller coaster? And if the client says, oh, I used to love it when I was a kid, I'd say, well, grief is kind of a roller coaster. But if the client says, I was fearful, I was terrified of roller coasters, you don't want to turn and say, well, grief is like a roller coaster. Not a therapeutic metaphor. Other ones are like waves at a beach. Some waves, they come out, you think they're going to be hard, and they are. Sometimes they're not as hard as you thought they were going to be. Others just take you by surprise. Another favorite metaphor of mine is grief as a journey, but I like to give these metaphors to people because you can act with them then and interact with them. And again, what's the client metaphors of grief? So for instance, if you say grief is a journey, you can explore. Where do you get rest? What gives you respite on your journey? Are family members in the same place? What's your destination? Where do you hope to go? But here's an important point. Grief is not a time-bound process that ends in detachment. We don't get over it. We live with a loss. And that's important for setting goals. The first thing that I ask for people when they come into counseling is I ask them, have you ever, I would ask them a question, what is your goal? What are you looking for from this counseling? And a lot of times they'll say to me, I need to get over it, I need to find closure. Bring closure to the term closure. Not a useful concept. And I'll say, do you want that? And they'll often look and say, no, I never want to forget this person. I always want this person to be part of my life. I like to use the term amelioration of grief. And that means the intensity of grief reactions diminish. People function as well as they did, sometimes better than they did prior to the loss. But yet you live with grief. And there are times you'll have what we call a developmental effect, surges of grief. It may be that your father died when you were 14. 10 years later, you're walking down the aisle with your uncle, with your brother, with your mother, with your stepfather, and all of a sudden, at that moment, even in the midst of that happy occasion, you realize your father's missing, and you have a surge of grief. And what I always do at termination is I ask clients, what are some of those moments in your life when we talk about this, where you might find those surges of grief? So when they come, they're not unpredictable, and they're recognizable. And again, we keep all kinds of connections. They're part of our memories. They're part of our biography. Who we are is affected by the people who help make us. The legacies and liabilities. One of the things I do every morning is I make a list of things to do, color-coded list of things to do. I'll finish the Force lecture and cross that out soon. But the point I'm trying to make is my dad used to do that. It's like a legacy that I got, and my son does it now. My grandson doesn't yet, but he's young. Spiritual connections, wherever we believe in our spiritualities. And of course, what we talked about is extraordinary experiences. And again, family bonds can also be maintained by stories. I'm going to be feeding February, well, you can read the cartoon. But one of the stories we have in my house is we live in a house that now has been in the family I don't live in that house, but I grew up in a house that's been in our family for 5 generations. I never knew my maternal grandmother. Evidently, she struggled with depression, and she died by suicide when my father was relatively young. But one of the stories we have is that she died in the basement. We like to joke that the cellar is haunted and that grandma's down there. But she's a benign ghost. And I think it's a way of reminding that we're still connected to her, and a way of keeping her in our family life. And again, one of the techniques you can do with people is just take a shell and talk about how the deceased imprinted on you. You know, as you put the shell into sand, in your values, in your beliefs, in all those kinds of things that the people we have. And then you can ask the question, what are these imprints do I want to keep? And maybe what are some of these imprints that are more liabilities? And we also have to realize that there are problematic connections. One of them is what I call the ghost rules. And what I mean by that is we made promises to somebody that died. We made promises to somebody that died, and we feel compelled to keep those promises even though they may not be as viable now. I had a woman once who came to me for therapy. This is interesting because I was her third person she sought therapist, and her first male. And she was a middle-aged woman when she got married. She married a man about 20 years older than her. And one of the things he did, he was a retired cop, and one of the things he believed is that women shouldn't drive. But for her, it had a plus sign. He'd drive her anywhere. Drive her to work, pick her up from work, whatever she needed. He was her ready chauffeur. And then when she died, she was reluctant to start driving again because she said, I promised Tony I wouldn't drive. Tony didn't believe that women should drive. And I said, well, you know, that was good for Tony at the time, but what about now? And we got through it. But she said the thing that she liked is I never challenged her. She said, I guess that was a mistake of mine. I said, if I could find somebody who would drive me everywhere, I'd be perfectly happy not to drive again. I'd love that. And she laughed at that, and I think that established our rapport. Or sometimes there's no acknowledgement of loss, and these kinds of connections impair growth. And again, you know, the message of research is that continuing bonds can be good, but can be problematic. And again, you always have to assess that within a culture. You know, certain cultures have that. For instance, in Asian cultures, it's very common that people will have essentially an altar to a deceased relative. Another thing to think about is post-mortem identity. Here's something to think about. Your identity can change even after you're dead. You know, and that's very common now. Think about how the argument over statues. You know, people we once looked at, we look at differently now. And this can complicate the mourning process. As a matter of fact, Rubin says sometimes that revelations about the deceased, maybe that they were a pedophile or that they were a war criminal, can be as traumatic to survivors as traumatic circumstances of death. So, you know, so we need to know that. So, let's spend the last few minutes then on how we counsel individuals struggling with loss. And again, I want to emphasize the importance of strength-based approaches. So, it's important to ask, you know, start out by saying, what happened to you, rather than what's wrong with you. And again, I'm not going to go over this. Many of you who are counselors know this, but grief counseling builds on basic counseling skills. That's all there is to it. And it's important, and again, it's important for clients to initiate contact. I always get calls saying, my brother's fiance is grieving, can you call her? And the answer is no, but I'm happy to have her call me. And again, it's not a status thing, but good therapy means that somebody has to reach out and say, I need your help. A good grief counselor has to have knowledge about grief, and there are too many people walking around grief counseling based on outmoded theories. They need to have a sensitivity of loss, and they need to understand the importance of validation. And again, use multiple methods and approaches. There's no silver bullet. Individual grief means individual treatment. So we need to be eclectic. In other words, you know, try out things, experimental. and be prescriptive. In other words, what I mean by that is if I'm recommending a book to somebody, I won't say, get a book on grief. I'll recommend a particular title for a particular reason. And again, that's what we call the experimental ethos. I like to use the rule of three. And what I mean by the rule of three, whenever I talk about an intervention, I usually try to give people three choices. You know, some people deal with guilt by doing this, some people deal with guilt by doing that, some people write a letter to the deceased, and at least three examples, what gives you examples? You know, what you think might work for you, or maybe something else would. Because one seems to say you should do this, two seems to say do this or that. Once you get into three, it kind of stresses you make a choice. And again, psychoeducation is really important. Most people much of grief counseling can be brief counseling. They only need to have their needs validated. They only need to be able to say, this works for me. And again, I like to use the task model. It acknowledges that individuals face grief in their own way. It's nonlinear, and it stresses the individual autonomy. And of course, it reminds us that our job is not to do grief work for clients. Our job is to help clients do it. So again, assess problems, identify barriers, structure interventions, and the like. So what's about the first task? To acknowledge the loss. Well, we do that by mourning rituals. Avoid euphemisms. This is one of the hardest things that I think new grief counselors struggle with. And what I mean by that is it's very hard to say to people, you know, where were you when your husband died? What were you doing when your husband died? And we often use euphemisms. A colleague of mine, Hannah Laura Wass, did a study of euphemisms. Anybody want to guess what the three greatest, how would we say that? The largest number of euphemisms are in one of three categories. Anybody know what those three categories are? You got one and two. Sexual behavior has about 1,200 euphemisms in the American language. Death has about 600. Anybody want to guess the third? Nope. Do any of you have to use the facilities? Are you going to do number one or number two? Isn't it interesting? Sex, bathroom behavior, and death, all grouped together as things we find it difficult to talk about. Have them talk about the event, and sometimes they'll be very repetitive, but that's how they're making sense of it. You know, one of the things that I do often is what we call retelling the story. And then as they retell the story, see the parts that get them emotional, the hot spots, and assist them in dealing with that. Expressing manifest and latent feelings. And the goal here, that's why I have an onion, is kind of, you know, decathexing the relationship. And we do that by creating a non-judgmental environment, by validating feelings, by coping with ambivalence, by talking about emotionally difficult events, by dealing with unfinished business, and by coping with guilt. One of the questions that I find most helpful there is saying, would others find you guilty? That's often a good question to ask. And then assessing extraordinary experiences. And sometimes in spirituality, you can use the role of enlightened, what I call enlightened ignorance. For example, I once had a client who was struggling with his wife, and we began to talk about how his spirituality spoke to him. So we can do things like that. And of course, we're going to talk about therapeutic ritual. And again, when you're dealing with ambivalence, sometimes it helps to separate the person. You know, let's talk about person one, the good Tommy. And let's talk about person two, the bad Tommy. And how do we reconcile these? Another thing that's a technique is when clients have persistent nightmares. I had one woman, for example, who had a recurring nightmare that her son was in hell after he died by suicide. And it really helped him to kind of, you know, rethink how she wanted that dream to end. We have to live in a changed world. And that means the value of giving choices, to plan for difficult times, to assess those secondary relationships that we have and losses, and assess changes in coping styles. And again, stress our strengths. And here's an important thing. Always explore successful and unsuccessful adaptations and problem solve. And again, avoid isolation and give support. And one of the things that I do with support is I ask clients to write down the names of their support system. And then I say, put a D next to everybody who's a good doer. Put an L next to anybody who's a good listener. And then there are other people on your list, what I call respite people. They get an R. And I would say grief is hard work. And like any hard work, you need time off. So, here's how you deal with that. This is the person you go out with, and they're never going to say to you, how are you really doing since your spouse died? Because they don't want to talk about it. And they hope you don't talk about it. But that's their gift. They give you space away. And again, stress management is here. I'm just going to move on to some of these. One technique that I like is a variation of the empty chair, where a client offers advice about the grief journey to an empty chair. And then we have to stay connected. And how do we manage those continuing bonds? And how will we remember that person? So again, we can make these slides available to people, right? Yes. And how would we do that? Email. Okay, so email and they'll get them available, because I know I'm going through these last ones fast, but I'm running out of time. And of course, then we can do benefit finding too. How has this experience changed you? And lastly, we have to rebuild faith in philosophical systems that are challenged by loss. So again, it's simply asking the question, how does your faith speak to you? And help make meaning making. So again, as we move to termination, Catherine Sanders, who is a grief counselor, has 3 questions that she asks clients, and I do the same. What do you want to take from you're going into a new life now. What do you want to take from your old life into your new life? What do you want to leave behind? What do you need to add? And again, review the surges. I always like to ask the question, if I meet you in a year, and I say, how are you doing? It's been a year since we ended counseling. What are you going to say? And that helps me to get them to emphasize what they've learned and what they've employed, what insights they have, and the like. And again, we don't have to do this alone. Self-help books can be very, very valuable. They validate, they teach us coping techniques, they give us hope, and bibliotherapy can be a good intervention. Sorry, one of my favorite cartoons, Sorry, No Water, we're just a support group. But I believe in support groups very much. They provide validation, they provide ventilation, they give us respite and support. We learn coping techniques. They give us hope. And what we've also learned is that helping others is therapeutic for ourselves. And of course, if you're inclined, expressive approaches are great, especially with children. They bridge us to nature and spirituality. They're natural. When I always work with games and music, anything with children that's expressive. They're reflective. Why did you draw that? Why did you make your mother that color? They're cathartic. If you're angry, you're drawing hard. And they often project things that we don't even realize we want to say. And one of the big things that I've written about and that I think is a very important tool is what I call therapeutic ritual. And I think it comes out of my clerical background. But sometimes in the course of the journey of grief, I will help people create rituals, personal rituals, that are important to them. And in my work, I've developed 4 kinds of rituals. One is a ritual of continuity. And a ritual of continuity is just a ritual that says we maintain a continuing bond. One of the things we do in my house is we have a family party the night before we have a community party to decorate the Christmas tree. And the first 3 ornaments we put on the Christmas tree are memorial ornaments to my parents and my godson's father. It's a way of saying, we can talk about you, even during this Christmas. We can say we miss you. We can say we love you. Another ritual is a ritual of transition. A ritual of transition says, I'm in a different place in my journey of grief. The most powerful ritual of transition I was ever involved with was a woman who came in to see me because she couldn't remove her wedding ring. She'd been married for a number of years, and then he had been sick for the last 3 of those years. And she said, And that's, of course, one of the great things we don't always understand about caregiving. Caregiving is hard on both the caregiver and the person you're taking care of. And she said, the 3 years were miserable. He was a strong man who, as she put it, did not do sick well. And she said every day, and he had Lou Gehrig's disease. He said, and every day as he got weaker, we struggled and we fought. And it was he hated being dependent. But every night when we went to bed, we'd put our hands together so our rings touched. And we'd repeat our wedding vows in sickness and in health, in good times and in bad. And she said that got us through to the next day. And she said when he died, she said I took off his wedding ring and kept it because he was so weak, it just kind of was, and so emaciated by the disease that it hung too loosely on his finger. And she said, but I want to start dating now. It's been 3 years. I'm a middle-aged woman. I want to start dating now, but I can't date with the ring, and I can't seem to take it off. So as we talked about it, we found out the importance of the ring. She was Catholic. She very strongly believed that marriage was forever. And so one day we went back to the Catholic church in which she was married. And as she went back there after Mass on Sunday in front of her family and friends, she repeated the priest brought her up to the altar and repeated her wedding vows, but in the past tense. Were you faithful in sickness and in health, in good times and in bad? And he could confirm that he had been. And she said, the priest said, may I have the ring, please? And she said the ring came off as if by magic, was how she described it. And what the priest did was took the ring, we had planned this ahead of time, had them interlock with one another, and welded to the frame of her wedding picture. This vow was now complete. And she was able to take it off in that way. Sometimes we have rituals of reconciliation. And rituals of reconciliation are just rituals that say, I'm sorry, forgive me, or I forgive you. Could be reading a letter. One of my favorite rituals was maybe reading a letter at the memorial stone. And then finally, we have rituals of affirmation. This I added later on when my godson, who was about 9 at the time, taught me about this. Some of you know that my earlier area of interest, before I got interested in death and dying and gerontology, was juvenile delinquency. And I was involved in a 70s program that mentored at-risk delinquents. It was kind of like a Big Brother program. And we were kind of assigned kids who were deemed at risk for delinquents. They took kids from Astoria that was before Astoria was a very fashionable neighborhood. They took kids from Astoria who were at risk for delinquency and assigned them to kids in college from the neighborhood. So I got assigned this kid, Michael. Michael wasn't at risk for delinquency, he was quite delinquent when I had him. So, so we were taught to take them out places, so I used to take them fishing, ironically not far from here, in Rifton. And so I used to take him fishing there, and he never had any patience. He would constantly pull at the lure and break it when he got stuck. And he lost a lot of lures on me. So one day when he was about 12, I opened my tackle box and he threw in about a dozen new lures. And I looked at him and I said, Michael, are these hot? And he looked at me very hurt. He said, I would tell you if they were hot. I said, okay, really sorry. I had to ask. About 5 years later, we're fishing, and he opens my tackle boxes. Hey, you still got the hot lures. I said, Michael, we had a rule that we were always going to be honest to each other. I'm troubled that you lied to me. He said, I didn't lie to you. He said, if you remember, he said, I said to you, I would tell you if they were hot. He said, I never said when I would tell you. They're hot. I told that story at his funeral, and his son loved it, and makes me tell it all the time, and even to this day in his 40s. And one day, when we were going up to the Catskills for a vacation, and Keith was with us, with my son and Kathy, and I said, hey, Keith, remember that story? That happened just down that road. He said, I want to see it. I want to go there. And we found an old lure, as we, and Michael and Kathy said, "You guys go." My son Michael and Kathy said, "You guys go." So the two of us went, and we found a rusted old lure, and he got a great kick at that. He was about 9, and he said, "This is a gift from my dad." So we decided to do a ritual around it. And I gave him the lure, and I said, "This is a gift from your dad, but the best gift I ever got from your dad was you." And he gave it back to me, and he said, this is a gift from my dad, but the best gift I got was you." And we hugged, and I said, "What do you want to do with it?" He said, "Where did my dad lose it?" And I showed him a clump of weeds, and he tossed it in. So just to summarize, it acknowledges a variety. Contemporary grief theory acknowledges that all kinds of losses deal with grief. They move from predictable sets of stages to personal pathways. There's increased attention to the cognitive and spiritual aspects of loss, increased recognition of continuing bonds, of the possibilities for growth, even in grief, for the recognition of cultural influences, and for eclectic yet evidence-based approaches. So let me thank you. Thank especially the Kaplan Family Foundation, Mount St. Mary,